Let us remember this Sunday, or if I might say, let us try to remember the homily as 3D. 3D. It's going to be delight, discipline, and diversity. Okay? 3D. I'd like to look at the readings and then reflect on each one of the Ds, because I think they flow from the nature of the feast as well as from the readings themselves. In the first reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah, and then especially in the responsorial psalm. The responsorial psalm is one of my absolute favorites. I praise you, O Lord, for I am wonderfully made. Now, a number of us may have some doubts looking in the mirror or looking at the scales or any number of things, whether we're wonderfully made. But this is a more profound thing than physical beauty, which fades in many ways, many times. O Lord, you have probed me, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I stand. You truly form my inmost being. You knit me in my mother's womb. How could you ever think of yourself as dirt or scum or rot? This is a pretty bold claim. Where can I flee from you? It's also part of this psalm. You're at the end of Psalm 139. The assignment for this evening is to read that psalm. Blow the dust off your Bibles. Go home, and sometime before you go to bed, read that psalm. O Lord, from my birth, from my mother's womb, you gave me my name. And then a couple lines later in that first reading, you formed me as a servant from the womb. None of us is an accident. None of us is arbitrary. This is an extremely important claim. Everybody has human dignity because we're creatures of God, formed from the womb. That means nobody gets accepted from God's love, that is, removed from God's love. The first reading makes that clear. Secondly, it also talks about how often we think we toil in vain. Who here has not, of a certain age, thought at different times, is that all there is? Remember that great song by Peggy Lee? Is that all there is? If that's the case, bring on the booze. Forget that line. That was just from Peggy Lee. But we toil in vain and for nothing. Uselessly, it seems like nothing is functioning, nothing is going well. You can be right at the bottom. And then he reminds us, Isaiah does, we're formed as in the womb from the very beginning. We're not a mistake. God has plans for us. And at the end of that reading, we see, I will make you a light to the nations. A light to the nations. Not just to Israel. Jews, for a variety of reasons, for the most part, except Chabad, do not evangelize. They do not proselytize. If you want to join Judaism, you can, but they're very hesitant. Nonetheless, in several important places in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Old Testament, there are clear statements about being universal. And in fact, one of the ways in the last century, some Jews reflected on Christianity as Judaism for the world. You may not think of yourself that way, but it's an interesting concept. The second reading from the Acts of the Apostles is more explicit about John the Baptist. It says, from this man's descendants of David, Jesus will come. But John the Baptist heralded his coming, it says, by proclaiming a baptism of repentance to all people of Israel. And he also says, in the text, this is Luke, the Acts of the Apostles, that's Luke, I am not worthy to unfasten the sandals of his feet. You may remember from the Gospel of John, there's a statement that John the Baptist makes about Jesus. He must increase, and I must decrease. How many of you know, just a show of hands, how many of you, make sure that you film so they show the congregation, how many of you know that why we have the feast of John the Baptist on the 24th of June? Because that's when he was born? No. It's because, in fact, on the 24th of June, we celebrate, well, not quite exactly, but we do, the summer solstice. That is, from this time on, each day, in the northern hemisphere at least, the light diminishes. I must decrease. You must increase. Why do we have the Feast of Christmas celebrated on the 25th of December? Now you get it, don't you? Yeah, you celebrate it because we don't know when Jesus was born, but he is the light of the world. And more exactly, from the 21st of December on, the light increases. So there is a way in which there is a kind of cosmic choice for when to place liturgical celebrations. And then in the gospel, remember, Elizabeth and Zechariah were advanced in age. Now, I don't know what that means, but they were ordinarily beyond the age of childbearing. And they had had no children, and to be barren was really almost considered a curse. Today we aim at 1.7 children. In those days they wanted to see quite a few children for a variety of reasons. And so it happened that Zechariah doubted. He was made mute, but nonetheless Elizabeth conceives and brings forth John. But you notice, there are two things that indicate there's absolutely something new going on. The first thing is, elderly couple conceive and have children. Not quite as dramatic as being a virgin and a mother, but nonetheless, being elderly and conceiving. The second thing that is new is right here. I don't know if you caught it. So they're going to name the child. We're in a patriarchal society. Who has the right to name the child? The father. Definitely. And what do they usually name the child? Same thing, the name of the father. Zechariah will name his son Zechariah. Well, he can't speak. A woman's delight. And what? So she says, no, his name's going to be John. But I don't know if you know this, but the name John in Hebrew means God is gracious. God is gracious. It's a beautiful name, John. So she says his name Zechariah is going to be John, and immediately they gesture to the father, because patriarch, you got the right to name him. You tell me who he is. And he can't speak, so he writes it out, John. That's the second big surprise. They're not naming him in the traditional. This is something new. John the Baptist is new. He's heralding the beginning of the new age. And at the very end, they cut out, I always like to see how these people put together the lectionary. The reading is from chapter 1, verses 57 to 66, verse 80. They spared us 12 verses. Why? Well, at one point in the reading, he says, "What then will this child be?" And that's when Zechariah, his mouth now open, sings the Benedictus, which you have in your morning prayer, if you follow that. And what does he tell us about the child? Let me read it. "And you, child, will be called prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his way, to give knowledge of salvation to his people in the forgiveness of their sins through the tender mercy of God." That's who John the Baptist is. That was cut out of the reading. Okay, so you've got these three readings. I want to draw three conclusions. The first is delight. Delight. In the story of Mary's visit to her cousin Elizabeth, which makes Jesus and John the Baptist first cousins, right? When she visits, Elizabeth comes out to greet her, and what happens? The baby in her womb, which is maybe 6 months, 7 months along, according to the text, leaps for joy. I've never been pregnant, but I have 3 sisters who've been very Catholic, and I have followed them closely, and I'll tell you, this may seem stupid, but there's nothing I found more thrilling that as the child gets 5th month, 6th month, 7th month, is to put my hand on one of my sisters' stomachs and feel the movement. I mean, at times, like almost rib crushing. Those are always the daughters. At any rate, it's really a striking thing. That baby leapt. It had an instinct that his whole vocation was going to be oriented to what was in Mary's womb. 2 pregnant women meeting, 2 infants in the womb meeting, and 1 leaping for joy. So one of the first things I want to say, and I think is important, is to realize that at the center of our way of life as Christians is joy. Now, when you meet some of us on the street, that isn't the first quality we think of. These can be difficult times. But remember, Jesus says, I want you to have life and have it in abundance. I'll give you the joy that the world does not give. That doesn't mean always being happy. There are people that do bounce around. They're always happy. I'm German. I dislike them. It bothers me. You will shut up, but so that's not what we're talking about, not this kind of giddy thing. Jesus doesn't want us always to have entertainment. Jesus wants us to have engagement. The great paradox is the best way to be free is to commit yourself to something significant, and then joy is released. So the first thing is we're called to be joyful. As Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. The second point, and that is discipline. You knew I would get to that. Discipline, the same word for discipleship. I love watching sports. I played a lot of them myself. I have 4 knee surgeries to prove it. But one of the things that's very clear is that great athletes, I was never a great athlete, but great athletes have tremendous discipline. They practice, they practice, they practice. That's why what they do, when they do it, looks so easy. I mean, you can be a natural athlete, okay, but you never become great unless you practice, and you practice endlessly. And eventually, what you want to do, you do more instinctively than simply thinking it, overthinking it. So discipline is something like that. That's why, don't you think, that's why we call, are you a practicing Catholic? You got to keep practicing. You never get it down. You call an observant Jew, but you call a practicing Catholic. Are you practicing? I think that's a great phrase. Where did we ever get that? I think we need practice. And coming together like this helps us to do that. The Jesuits gave us what is called the spiritual exercises. Exercises, a certain discipline, a certain rigor. It's very, very important. Muscles atrophy if they're not used. All you have to do is have a long stay in the hospital, as one of my confreres recently had, and he had to learn to walk all over again. Muscles are those things that if you use them more often, they get stronger. They don't get depleted. That's exercise. It's no different, my friends, it's no different in the spiritual life. Discipleship, discipline increases our capacity for joy and delight. Last point, diversity. What I want to say about this is when you see a story about John the Baptist is a rather forbidding figure. I mean, who wants to stay in the desert and eat honey and locusts? I mean, most people I know in Palm Desert don't eat like that. They have a summer home there, a winter home, get it straight. But I think that what you have when you have an example of John the Baptist is an example. He is a prophet. There are many ways to live the Christian life. Not all of us are called to be like John the Baptist. You might say, thanks be to God, but there are fundamental realities. Joy, discipline, those carry on for all of us. Think of Mary. Mary is very different, the mother of Jesus. Teresa of Lisieux in a contemplative monastery, trying to figure out how she could be distinctive. Paul, robust on the stage. John Paul II versus Benedict, very different kinds of people, very different. One very much at home on the stage, the other happy at home writing books. God calls us in many, many different ways. And it's very important to know that whatever the way is that we find ourselves in, we have been formed from the womb. It's not an accident. We're called by God to delight in Him for the joy not just that for ourselves, but for all whom we meet. That's discipleship. That comes from discipline. That's a great grace. That's the example of John the Baptist.